Hello everyone and welcome to the production of Balance. A little while ago I realised that about 61% of the views that I get on YouTube come from my music, and on SoundCloud Balance is clearly one of the best tracks that I've made, like by far. So I thought people like to listen to this sort of music, but I feel like a lot of people also like to have a look at what goes into the music itself, so all of the different elements, the different tracks, the different effects, because if people want to make this music themselves, they need to get an idea of all the layers that make up the music, all of the different tracks, effects and stuff. And this is probably the best way to do it, being able to not only play the whole track in its entirety, but being able to play each track on its own. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about all the different effects, all the different instruments, all the processing that's happened on all the tracks and the master track as well, and how the project has been organised. So yeah. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to start talking about the kick drum and all of the rhythmic parts as well. But firstly, the kick drum. The kick drum is one of the most essential parts of electronic music. EDM requires a punchy but also heavy kick drum that sets off like all of the rhythm, and in particular my one on its own sounds like this. It's quite punchy, it's a very prominent part of the music. But how did this one come about? Basically, Mixcraft, the software that I use at home, has a massive library with, how many sounds does it have? 7,961 different sound samples that you can use in your tracks. They're all royalty free and they're all very high quality. There's a specific kit called the Complexitro kit, which creates very heavy and very like mental sounds basically, and one of them is of course the kick, which comes from Complexitro. So it's kind of like the one I've got here, but what I've done is I've taken the kick and I've cut it down. I found the best sounding kick in that sample, and I've cut it down into one kick which I have effectively looped many times, and I've like copied and pasted because you don't need to have it different. The kick is not something you want to vary very much in this kind of music. So that's where the kick comes from. Effects wise, it has a compressor, which is the old classic compressor. You'll find this on a lot of digital audio workstations. The threshold has been turned down a little bit. The ratio has been turned to about 2 to 1. The knee is very soft. The attack is very fast, and the release is also quite fast as well. And overall the levels have been turned down, which gives a punchy but also prominent kick. And beneath that we've got an EQ where I've basically turned down the very low frequencies because we don't want the sub bass and the bass in general to get cut out, but I've boosted the frequencies around 63 Hz to just give it a bit more bass, just a tiny bit. It doesn't have to be that much. And because the kick from the sample is so loud, I've had to turn the levels all the way down to minus 12.2 decibels. So it's not exactly quiet, but it blends well with the rest of the mix. That's what we're looking for. And that's the kick drum. The clap sounds a little bit like this. Quite a syncopated rhythm, which works well with the kick drum. The clap comes from, believe it or not, the 808 to 909 kit, which is provided in not Logic, Mixcraft. It is down here somewhere. That's the 808 kick, or maybe the 909. I think that's the 909 kick, and the clap comes from here. I'll just keep spamming that over and over. Effects wise, it's been turned down just a little bit because again you don't want it to be too prominent in the mix. You want it just sitting down there, and often the clap is often quieter than you think. Effects wise, there's a compressor. But this time I'm using Acoustica's compressor. The threshold's been turned down a little bit, ratios not very much at all, and the attack and release have been left to what they are by default, and then it's been turned up a little bit, which cuts out the sounds that are just too loud. And of course, on most EDM stuff you get reverb. So the reverb I've turned down the high frequency damping. I've turned up the reverberation as well, so it sounds like a bigger room. Stereo width has been put to 100%, so it really feels like it's filling the room. And the wet to dry ratio is about 1 to 10, or it's exactly 1 to 10. If it's too wet, it sounds too heavy, even if you change these factors up here. And if it's like not enough, then you just won't hear it. So that is basically the clap. The snare has been used during build-ups, and it sounds a little bit like this. Nothing really special about the snare, to be honest. It's literally just like the same sort of rhythm. It's been quantized like effectively the entire song. As you can see, they're all in line with the bars. And also you can see here on this region there's an envelope. It's a volume envelope, but it starts off quiet around here, but it slowly gets louder to help, you know, create the build up, and then there it's very loud. This snare again comes from the 808 to 909 kit. I think that's more the 909 side because it's a bit more realistic, and effects wise also, well no, levels wise it's not been changed, but effects wise we've put an EQ on it. This time I've used the classic EQ, and I've turned up the higher frequencies like so, and turned down the very low frequencies so that they don't cut through with the bass, and I put a bit of reverb on it as well to keep it nice and like spacious. Not a lot of reverb on the snare, you don't need a lot, and also if you put too much reverb, even if that's reverberation or just making it wet, it sounds too damp, it doesn't sound right. So yeah, the hi-hat sounds a little bit like this. Very basic open and closed hi-hat rhythm that you hear in a lot of dance music. This one is also using the 808 to 909 kit. I think that's more the 909 side. It's not been panned, and levels wise it's been turned down by about 8 decibels, and it has no effects. The same can't be said for the ride, however. The ride sounds a bit like this. The ride again comes from the 808 to 909 kit. I use that kit a lot because that's one of the only decent kits you'll find in Mixcraft. The ride's been turned down a little bit to about 4.3 decibels, or minus 4.3 decibels. It has not been panned. And effects wise, the only thing there is reverb. It's a very wet reverb because a ride tends to be very wet and has a lot of reverberation and a very high stereo width as well. The crash is very basic and just sounds like this. Crashes are designed to have very long reverb tails, which is why this crash has reverb and also delay as well. So reverb wise it's very wet. EQ wise I've turned up the very high frequencies, and it has a delay on it as well. And this delay, it's synced to how many beats in a bar? So that would be 8 beats in a bar. So it's like da 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 da. It lasts for quite a while, but it's not very loud. Whereabouts does this come from is my question, because often what I do is I get them. This one comes from the library, but whereabouts in the library is a good question. Middle Eastern Drum and Bass is where it comes from. That's the kit used, somewhere in there. And yeah, that produces quite a nice long-lasting crash, which works well for EDM. There is also a reverse crash, which is used in a number of sections, like during, what section is this? The second break. So for example, here. So if I start playing it from here, you'll notice it. And yeah, that helps the build to actually start, and on its own it sounds like this. So it's effectively exactly what it is. It's a cymbal that has been played in reverse. Basically, they've taken the sound sample and they've reversed every sample, so it sounds like a snake effectively. It's a nice sound, but there's no panning or effects on it. It's just been turned down very far because the original sound is quite loud. The last percussion used in this song are the toms. Very basic, very vintage dance-like toms, and these toms come from a kit called the Dance Kit, which is something that I don't use very often. I mean, it's a bit ironic really, I should, but the quality of a lot of the stuff in here isn't very good, but the toms are actually not that bad. Yeah. And yeah, the toms only happen every now and then. They're just for a bit of emphasis in certain parts, like the chorus. So it happens here. So it kind of, adds a bit of emphasis just there. So that's essentially the rhythm. Now we get on to what makes up the sounds that everyone enjoys in EDM. So first of all, at the very top, you'll see these two tracks. One's called Milky Way and the other one's called Bell Pad. So you'll hear these during the second breakdown if I play it for you. I feel the balance when I'm on the ground. So, on their own, they sound like this. The Milky Way is a synth pad. Where does it come from? I think it's one of the softwares. Yes, so the actual program itself comes with a bunch of synths that can't be edited. So this is one of Acoustica's synths. So I can't actually show you exactly what goes into it because they like to hide that. However, I can talk about the levels. It's been turned down by 8 decibels. And it has a nice bit of reverb attached to it, which helps it create that nice spacious effect that you get in a lot of breakdowns. And this bell pad, where does this come from? Is this another acoustic instrument? Yes, it's actually 2 acoustic instruments. So it means I can't show you what it's made of. And again, I can show you the effects. It's been turned down by almost 10 decibels. It has been panned a little bit to the right, and effects-wise, it has a little bit of reverb on it as well. Now, I'm going to get onto the more important part of the project. In all EDM, you will find sidechaining is present. Now, if you're wondering what sidechaining is, it's basically a technique where whenever a certain instrument is played, such as the kick drum, a signal is sent to a effects unit, for example a compressor, and then that compressor does what it would normally do. It compresses when that signal comes through. So that means that if I send a signal from the kick drum to an instrument, whenever the kick drum plays, that instrument becomes a little quieter, and it's very quick. So it's like it's coming in and out. So I'm going to demonstrate this now in the first chorus. Let's compare that to if there is no compression. I don't actually have to do that, I can just untick these. If there's no compression, it sounds like this. Which sounds a bit weird. If I turn the compression back on, and if I turn the kick on, which is where the compression is actually coming from, you can hear that helps reinforce the rhythm, which is the whole purpose of sidechaining. The instruments that have actually been sidechained have all been grouped within one submix track, which I've named the sidechainers. These include literally all of the main parts, like the synth, the bass, the sub-bass, all the arpeggiators that happen, and some effects as well. This is because having a submix track means that I can put the effect of the compression straight into the submix track. So everything within the submix track gets the same effect, so the compression is applied in exactly the same way to all the tracks. So what do these tracks consist of? So the first track that you'll hear is this one called Synth Mallet, which sounds a bit like this. It's playing the main motif, and you'll hear it in the verses. This one is it's another acoustic one, isn't it? That's really annoying. But it does have reverb, which is quite prominent actually. If I turn the reverb off, which I need to do here, you'll hear it sounds like this. If I turn it back on, I did say it was prominent, but in reality it's not that prominent. It just adds a little bit of spatial awareness to the song. And this one's been turned down by a couple of decibels, so it's not too heavy in the mix. Okay, so the next track, which has been coloured orange, because it's a pad. It's called Star Quiet. It's basically a pedal note which sits at the top of the track when something's playing, and it sounds like this. It's literally just that throughout the whole track, but it has a few envelopes on it. So during certain sections, it'll be quieter and louder, so it's more prominent. And this is, this is another acoustic track. It does have this interesting thing called an autofiller. Now, I'm not entirely sure what an autofiller is. It's kind of like effect that fills in little blips and little sounds whenever it wants, and depending on how you set it. So I'm not really going to go into detail with that because one, I'm not entirely sure what it is, and two, I don't really see it used a lot in EDM music, so we're going to ignore it for now. This one's been turned down by about 4.5 decibels, and it has automation applied to it just before the drops. So just before the drop happens, it becomes quiet, like so. It's a bit glitchy there, but you can't hear that in the main track. And yeah, that's basically all the effects for that. Now we come into one of the most important tracks in the entire project, the main lead. So that is the main lead track. Is this another... so this is a non-acoustic instrument. This is one I can actually show you properly. So before I do, I will say it has reverb applied to it, so it's not that wet, but it needs to be quite wet, so it creates more spatial awareness. There's a lot of spatial awareness in EDM. It's what creates the atmosphere and the mood in the music, and that's created like purely using reverb, delay, and often panning as well, which I've not really done a lot of because it's just annoying. So what I've used here is a synthesizer in Mixcraft, a third-party synthesizer called the Messiah. Pretty decent name, and it does look pretty complicated, but basically, I mean, you can see it as it is. For the filter envelope, the attack's quite fast, but the decay and sustain are at the maximum, and the cutoff is also at the maximum for this specific instrument. So yeah, it creates quite a breathy sound, which is done using, I can't remember what waveform I've used for this. I think it's a sawtooth wave, and to be honest, I can't remember where you have to look to find it. It's not, I think it's here. Oh no, it's not a sawtooth, it's 2 square waves, I believe. Or maybe 3. It's weird. This synth is weird, but there's definitely square waves being used. They've got very high amounts of reverb within the synthesizer, so it's different to the reverb applied as an effect. And it also has quite a lot of voices, which creates the idea that there's a lot of oscillators playing at the same time. 6 voices means that 6 of these oscillators are playing at the same time. So just imagine 6 people playing the exact same tune. So it sounds like it's thicker. The texture is thicker. There's more people playing it. And that's one track, but you'll notice underneath that there is another track which you'll only hear during the second chorus. It's playing that second melody line. And this oops, that's not what I meant to do. This one's using the same sound effectively, but there's a few differences. Like for example, the release has changed a little bit, and it's effectively the same sort of thing, but there's just a few differences in levels and effects. I don't think I duplicated the track. I think I made it a little bit similar, but not exactly the same. And then after that, you can hear it's playing an octave higher, which helps complement the main melody. Yeah, I mean, it might be that you've not noticed these things before, but these are just things that you like pick up when you're listening to the track. And if you've heard that, you're definitely going to hear it now. Underneath the lead tracks, we have the first bass track. And that is essentially all it's playing. This only happens during the verse, and then during the build-up it kind of cuts down so you can't hear it, and then it happens during the second build as well. So this is made using a synth called the Renegade, and it's a very heavily made analog synth, and it kind of makes a lot of buzzy and fat and like like wet bass sounds. That's what it's designed for. So you can see down here there's no LFO modulations apart from here, but they're not like that one's not doing anything, so I just didn't bother using it. You can see here that it has the attack turned up or turned down, so it's as fast as it can be. So it's a very quick sound, which kind of helps the side chaining. The decay and the sustain are quite moderate, and the release is pretty high as well. The cutoff is at its maximum. If I turned it down, it would sound like this. Not really much difference, to be honest. I think it's more this cutoff that does the work, because that is the filter. So let me turn that one down instead. Yeah, that's definitely made the difference. If I turn it up, it doesn't sound as plucky. It kind of defeats the purpose of the decay. So yeah, that sounds about right. And if I turn the resonance up, kind of sounds a bit more like a laser gun, which is not what we want. Okay, so there's that, and that doesn't really play very often, but underneath we've got something a lot more important. We've got the chords that play throughout the whole piece. Yes, so these chords are made up of a number of different notes, including, let's have a look, E flat, E flat, A flat, and another E flat. So it's basically just octaves with, I think that's the fifth. Hang on. I can't remember if A flat is the fifth, but it's kind of in that scale. It sounds well. And then there's also a few other notes here, like B flats, Bs, and Cs, which help to add to the melody, which I personally think sounds pretty good. And this is probably the thickest sound in the piece. This comes from the Messiah, I think. Yeah, this is Messiah. The cutoff has been not quite turned up to the maximum. The decay and the sustainers are both at the maximum. The attack is as fast as it can be, and the release is also very high, which is quite important. If I were to turn down the decay, you'd hear a much more pluckier sound, which is, we could have that as an intro, but we want it to be nice and thick, and that's what we've got. This is also achieved with lots of reverb, which, as you can see here, it's very wet and very reverberated. And EQ wise, the higher ones have been turned up to create that kind of high thickness, I guess you can call it. There needs to be something up there that works well with the main melody, the main lead. So if I were to go to the chorus and play just the chords and the main lead, you'd hear this. Yeah. So I could have turned the lead up a bit, to be honest, but that's kind of all it needed. It has not been panned, because that would have sounded a bit weird if the main chords were like right over to your left. And it's been turned down by 8.7 decibels, so it's quite quiet within the mix. You definitely don't want the chords to be the loudest thing. I mean, you can automate them at the start if you want the chords to be the louder things at the start, and then you can keep them slightly quieter, like in the chorus and the outro, so that people don't notice. We've also got an ostinato that plays just underneath the chords, which sounds like this. It literally plays that whenever the chords are playing, and it also plays during the second verse. It's been turned down a lot because it really needs to be quiet in the mix. Effects wise, it just has reverb. I think it's the same reverb as the track above, and I do believe it is also the Messiah. In fact, I think it's a copy of the Messiah above. Yes, that's Greg Trancey. And that's also Greg Trancey. Yeah, so they're basically presets which you can mess around with until you find a sound that you like. So it's the same as the chords above, but of course if it was exactly the same it wouldn't sound very good. It would blend in too well with the chords. So it's been turned down. The actual effects applied have changed as well, and of course it's an octave higher, playing different notes. Here we've got the sub bass, which every EDM track needs a decent sub bass, and while this might not be the best sub bass because it's not very siny, it is still pretty decent. The good thing with sub bass is that it sidechains very well. Now, the actual synth used to create this sine bass is quite interesting because It's a recreation of the Minimoog, as you can see. If you find a real Minimoog hardware unit, you'll find it actually looks very, very similar to this layout that they've used here, because they obviously wanted it to be as similar as possible. So what I've done with the sub bass is I've effectively created my own preset. I've turned the cutoff down, but not too far, because if it's too far, it actually sounds too subby. And it also sounds a bit weird. And if I turn it up, it sounds a bit too fuzzy. You'd probably call it fuzzy, but basically what we're doing is that if we turn it down, we're cutting out the higher frequencies. By turning up the cutoff, we're letting the higher frequencies through, which makes it sound like fuzzy. The attack is quite low because we don't want it to be like clicking, which is what sub bass can do, especially with this preset. The decay is like moderate, and the sustain is quite moderate as well. Sub bass, you don't want it to drop out, you want it to stay there in the mix, and the release is quite high as well, which is surprising for sub bass. Are there effects on this? Apparently there are. Didn't realise. It's been turned down by 11 decibels. No automation. Effects wise, it just has EQ, where basically I've messed around with the middle and lower frequencies, because of course sub bass, you want to be careful. I've also turned down the higher ones completely because I really don't want those coming through. I think that's the sub bass done. Now I can move on to the two arpeggiators. This arpeggiator sounds a bit like this. This one comes from the Messiah. A lot of good stuff can come from the Messiah because it's a very old but also decent sounding synthesizer, and you can see the arpeggiator section of the synthesizer is in effect. It's using a preset called Arp Astral P, which I've messed around a little bit. I've turned the attack down very low, and I've kept the decay, the sustain and the release quite high, and the cutoffs quite high as well, which keeps it quite prominent. You've probably heard me using the term prominent quite a lot because it's useful to know what's prominent and what's not in a mix. It's basically saying what's loud and what's not really. So you can see the arpeggiator bit's working, and what it is it's constantly changing the amount of filter that's coming through. So if I were to play it now, you can hear that the notes are changing. Well, it's playing the same note, but the levels of the note are changing, but also the filter of the note is changing as well. Otherwise it would literally just be the same note. And what I mean by that is, if I did this, if I turned all of these down, what would that sound like? It's kind of taken out all the frequencies. If I do this, this is going to remove all the frequencies, I think. Yeah, that's taken out all the frequencies in that arpeggiator. You'll notice that it kind of changed a little bit there because of something called a LFO, or low frequency oscillator, which is doing something separate. The synth doesn't always work as one unit. You've got a lot of different things happening at the same time, which don't often cooperate with each other, which is why they're like separated into these different blocks. If I were to get rid of this, for example, nothing would happen because I've essentially gotten rid of the arpeggiator, and something is happening because of A, what's happening elsewhere in the synth, and B, because I've not turned these down all the way. It's a bit fiddly. So I'm just going to leave that. This second arpeggiator sounds a bit like this. It makes up a bit more bass in the arpeggiator, and it sounds a bit different, and funny enough also uses the Messiah. Where is it? Here it is. So yeah, same sort of thing really. The attack on this one is a lot slower, so it's not a sharp sound, but the cutoff is also quite high, so perhaps it is quite a sharp sound. And this one is very useful for making up texture in EDM. Arpeggiators are pretty decent for making up texture, and this one in particular, combined with the arpeggiator above, pretty good, not gonna lie. Neither of them have been panned. This one has been turned down a little bit by 4.3 decibels, and effects wise it has had EQ, where I've basically turned down most of the lower frequencies so I can let the sub bass come through. I also decided to add the sound from an organ. This is kind of what I mean when EDM has a lot of layers. When I say that, you definitely won't see this very often. You definitely won't see organs in EDM, but this definitely adds to the rhythmic element of EDM. And there isn't really much to say about the organ. There's no effects. It's been turned down a little bit. It's not been panned. That's all it is. It's just a rhythmic addition to the texture. Now, underneath that is something a bit more important. There's just a noise sample which comes from the library. I'm going to have to find that in a minute. Which helps to create the element of space. It's been turned down very heavily because of how loud it is originally. Effects wise, it just has reverb, of course, to help create that effect, and it's probably the wettest sound in the mix, with a wetness of 40%, and the dryness has also been turned down a little bit as well, just because. And has this one been panned? No. Now, this one comes from, let's find out where this is from. Progressive trance. So yeah, this one's a bit more sensible when it comes to picking out samples, considering that it comes from trance. I mean, this might not be trance, but it's the same sort of principle. It's electronic, and you can find a lot of decent electronic stuff, no matter where you get it from, whether it's from trance, electronic, complex electro, dubstep, even dubstep and drum and bass work really well. There's a couple of effects that have been used in the track as well, and I'm not talking about effects as in what are actually on the tracks. I'm talking about a track themselves that have been used for effect in the music. So what you heard there was just a very basic sweep, and this one uses one of my favourite synthesizers in Mixcraft called Nightlife, which is designed for dance and trance tracks. So it's very appropriate for stuff like this. It's a bit hollow and a bit dry sometimes, which is quite irritating, but it's good for messing around with. So basically what I've done here is I've taken an empty preset just called init, short for initialize, because that's how it is when the synthesizers initialize. There's just nothing. I've turned down all of the basic sounds, all of the oscillators, so there's nothing coming through except noise, which is a separate oscillator on this synth. So if I were to click this and then grab a note and just press any note on the keyboard, you'd hear a low rumble. So that's not very useful until we change the cutoff point. So if I change the cutoff point, I can create that sweeping noise, and then I can change the volume whenever I want. I've done that using automation, which is not there, it's here, cutoff. You can see here the cutoff starts off low, but as the sound progresses, and then it drops again. Yeah, so that effectively creates the sweep sound, and that happens 3 times in the track. Once at the very beginning, once in the first build, and once in the second build. And just before the thing happens, the thing like drops, you'll see that the volume has been completely cut out so that there's nothing coming through, which helps emphasize the drop. Beneath this is an effect which I've named Swish. This is an external effect which I've gotten from my library of sounds, which I've downloaded from the internet and various sources, and uses sounds like this and this. Very, very basic and subtle sweeping sounds created from just noise, no oscillators, but they can be really helpful and interesting in a track. This in particular has been turned down quite a lot because, again, the original sound is very loud, so it has to be turned down, and it's kept in the center, and both effects have got reverb applied. It's quite wet and quite reverberated, so that's that. Now, the final track, which is probably one of the most important tracks in any kind of music really, is the vocal track. Have you ever lost yourself in a never-ending place of space and time? Now, when it comes to vocals, I definitely do not have a high-quality mic, like a Rode mic or a Shure mic. I just have a terrible desktop mic, and I have to do some very heavy processing so that it doesn't sound terrible. But what I've done is, For each region that exists in the track, I've had to carefully edit the volume envelopes, so you can see if I come over here just before the sound actually starts, so just before I start singing, I've had to cut out all of the sound before that, because normally what happens is there's a lot of noise before you start singing. So if I cut that out, you won't hear anything until my voice comes in. And you can probably hear the effects as well. So effect wise, there's quite a few effects on this. First of all, there's a compressor. All vocals tend to use compression, because what happens is when you're singing there's a lot of quiet parts and there's a lot of really loud parts, so the dynamic range of the vocals must be reduced to help produce the track. So what I've done is I've turned the threshold down very low, I've turned the ratio very high to basically over 3 to 1. It's still a soft knee, knee's not really important here. The attack is quite fast and the release is relatively fast, not as fast as the attack. And the levels have been turned down to prevent any kind of distortion and kind of to prevent it from being too loud. There's also pitch correction, which stops me from hitting any bad notes, which is because I can't sing, and also because I actually think it sounds really decent in the track when you have, effectively auto-tune. Most people would just refer to it as auto-tune, but you should call it pitch correction because that's what it is. And then of course there's that lovely reverb sound, which is from the classic reverb. It's quite wet. There's a basic high boost using EQ, so I've taken out all the lower frequencies, which is called roll off, but this is like extreme roll off because it literally doesn't let through any low frequencies. And granted, that might not even matter because there might not be any low frequencies there to begin with. The microphone might not actually pick up the low frequencies, so it might not matter. And of course we've carefully boosted the high frequencies to let that come through. And because I don't sing when the main chords are playing either, that helps the vocals to kind of come through. So there's that. And then of course lastly we've got delay, which is synced to, it happens twice per bar. So if I turn all of these glorious effects off and just leave the vocals raw and unprocessed, you'll hear this. Have you ever lost yourself in a never-ending place of space and time? If I have the vocals with just the pitch correction, have you ever lost yourself? Sounds a lot more robotic, but I personally think a lot cooler, to be honest. If I have it with just reverb, have you ever lost yourself? And if I have it with just delay, have you ever lost yourself? Yeah, that one's not really heard very often. And the EQ, you won't notice the EQ or the compression. So if I have them all together, have you ever lost yourself? And finally, if I play it with the rest of the track, have you ever lost yourself in a never-ending place of space and time? Originally what I tried to do with the vocals was I tried to have some vocals doubling me. So what I did was I recorded my vocals, then I copied and pasted the same vocals but pitch shifted that downwards by an octave, so it sounded like kind of like a monster singing underneath me. Well, a lot of EDM tracks have that, you'll be surprised. And then during the chorus you should be able to hear this. Balance, 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 balance. Which yeah. So that's effectively all you'd ever need to know about the vocal track. I've not turned down the vocal track, I tried to control it using the compressor, and of course I've not panned it. People don't tend to pan vocals, and there's nothing automated either. That is essentially everything you'd need to know about the tracks. Now, the way that this project has been organised, you can clearly see that at the top of the project I've used markers, which I can double click and then I can mess around with. So a lot of people don't tend to use markers because they don't think that they will help them. They don't think that they're very important. But believe me, markers are like one of the first things you should look to and probably will look to when you're trying to move around in a project. I'll be like, I'm trying to find out whereabouts is the chorus. What am I looking for? Should I look for where I put that synth? Oh no, that's the wrong part. So making sure that you have markers in your project, because what tends to happen is, especially in Mixcraft, but not so much in Logic, they kind of cut through the whole track. You can see that there's still lines rather than just at the top with Logic. And yeah, that's effectively how it's been organised. And it doesn't really matter what you name them, just as long as the sections are relevant. So we've got the intro. There's always a marker at the intro by default. It's just called start. And then I've got verse 1, build 1, chorus 1, verse 2. There's like a break here, which then turns into a build, so I just call it break/build. And then another chorus, and then the outro. Which, by the way, I don't know if people notice, actually there are harmonies on the vocals. So if I just go back to the vocal track and just play it. Balance your note. Some very quiet harmonies there. Oh, and also this crash is another crash that I've used from Mixcraft's library, and it comes from Jungle Drum and Bass, funny enough. So yeah, you can get some like particularly weird stuff from these libraries, like I mentioned before. And finally, what is on the master track? There isn't really much on the master track, to be honest, but once you finish making the project and you're ready to start mastering, I mean, I'm not exactly an expert on mastering, but I know that whenever I export a track and I've not put certain features on the track, it will not sound half as loud as other tracks that exist. It's always been very confusing, but now I kind of get why. So first of all, I put an EQ on it, and when you're putting this on the master track, you've got to be very, very subtle with what you do. So I've done like a basic low cut to get rid of like the really low and like really bassy frequencies, because they are quite prominent in this track, and I've just left all the higher ones. You could have a slight roll off, which helps if you've got like certain speakers you want to use. But yeah, and then most importantly, on the master track, you've got a master limiter. Most would just be called a limiter, or sometimes a compressor. They're very similar, except the limiter, what the limiter does is, when it reaches a certain point, it's going to turn the sounds up, right? But when it gets to a point, it's going to stop them from getting louder. So if I were to play the track at the chorus, for example, right? So now it sounds like this. When the track reaches a certain loudness, it's actually getting turned down, but at the same time it's still being pushed, so it's really loud. What's it on now? -7. So if I were to turn it so it's completely off, you'll notice that it's a lot quieter than when it's at 7. And that kind of makes up the difference when it comes to mastering. If the track is too quiet, then it's just not going to work when you export it. That is essentially everything you'd need to know about balance. Personally, I really enjoyed making this. I made it within about a couple of days, to be honest, because this is basically all I do now. And yeah, I do hope that you enjoyed that. I hope that you learned something from it, and if you didn't, that's cool. I'm not really bothered either way. You're the one that watched this. So yeah. Thanks everyone for watching. Go check out Balance if you haven't already, because it is a sick track. You can check out Balance on YouTube, and it's also on SoundCloud as well, although I would definitely recommend the SoundCloud just because it's SoundCloud. It's a lot less saturated. Yeah, thanks again everyone. Bye.